Geordie, as 2025 is rolling to a close, we have passed what would be the 50th year anniversary of what some may consider the most influential and pivotal moment in Australian political history, or definitely top three, shall we say?
Definitely.
Which was the dismissal of Gough Whitlam as the Prime Minister in 1975. That is correct?
Yes.
Yes. So tell us about that. How has that shaped Australia since? And who were some of the characters involved? Because we've mentioned it briefly a few times on the podcast before, but we haven't actually gone as in-depth as we could have.
Yeah. Look, we'll have a bit of a discussion about this. As James said, it's the 50th anniversary since the dismissal of the Whitlam government by John Kerr, the Australian Governor-General at the time. It's probably the most significant point in Australian political history, I would say without a doubt. It's often referred to as the constitutional crisis. Others speculate that it was a coup, that there were entrenched, powerful conservative forces in Australia and the US and the UK that wanted the Whitlam government out as it tried to enact some quite significant reforms.
Yeah.
And I do support that position. I think there's a significant amount of evidence to suggest that there were forces at play undermining the Whitlam government the entire time. There's no smoking gun.
No.
However, once you start to look into the background of John Kerr, of the Governor-General, and what the CIA was doing in Australia at the time, and some of the on-record comments from the intelligence services, you have to speculate.
Yeah, of course. But obviously this was done it wasn't just enacted entirely by external actors.
No,
obviously.
definitely not.
So
Definitely
there was that element, that constituency in the Australian political and business elite, shall we say, that were completely on board with this as well.
Yeah, so when Whitlam came to power in 1972, the Liberal Party coalition was Liberal Party at the time. They had been governing Australia for the better part of 20 years. Obviously, Menzies served for almost those 2 decades, and they were just the ironclad party. No one ever saw Labor getting back in. They were just so undermined. The Australian economy had been going relatively well. People's living standings had risen year on year for the better part of 2 decades. So it just looked like Labor would never get back in. And then Whitlam came along, and it was during the 70s when television started to become a big thing. And what he did very successfully is he mirrored the kind of US style of theatre politics.
Yeah.
With the really silky slogans, the television. And he came from a middle-class background. He'd obviously been in the arts, in acting, in theatre. He knew how to perform.
Yeah, and he was an excellent speaker.
He was.
An excellent orator. Obviously, people argue that Menzies was as well, but I think a bit more relevant to where we are today and a bit more relatable to today, I think Gough Whitlam was a fantastic orator.
He was. Look, I don't want to go over and do the history of the dismissal. It can be quite dry.
Yeah.
If you want a good account of what happened, I suggest you go check out Mr. M History.
Yeah.
He's done a fair bit on this. What I wanted to just talk about briefly was, this was 50 years ago, right? However, what happened still lives with us today. Because what Whitlam tried to do was pretty radical in some ways. So in 3 years, he passed, I think it was close to 500 bills written up through the lower and upper house, which is just insane. I'm pretty sure it's the most bills ever legislated in a single term. But what it shows and what it demonstrates is that governments can reform Australian politics, is they can imagine big changes and they can legislate them through. Yeah. But it also demonstrates, I'm going to take a quote here from Michael Parenti, is that when change threatens to rule, the rules must change.
Yes. Yeah, very astute. Because I think you could say that lots of the things that we love about Australia today are a result of Gough Whitlam and the things he's passed.
They are, that's right, James, they're a direct result, and I just get up here some of the reforms that he actually pushed through. So basically in 3 years, 508 bills were passed and enacted, which is pretty insane. So the Whitlam government introduced reforms in basically every field, from health to housing, education, Indigenous affairs, women's rights, international relations, defence, environment. So he became Notable moments of his government included establishing the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. He ended conscription, removed the troops in Vietnam, handed the Gurindji people their deeds to their traditional rights, implemented legal aid programs, introduced universal care, free university education, and lowered the voting to 18. Notably, he also changed the national anthem from God Save the Queen to Advance Australia Fair.
Yep, respect.
Yeah. He abolished, traditional titles, so that we didn't have lords, for example.
Okay.
That we'd had from a hangover from the British. Created Consumer Affairs Commission, introduced the Family Law Act, the Racial Discrimination Act, publicly condemned the apartheid of South Africa, etc., etc.
So some pretty, shall I say, progressive.
Yeah.
And I guess at the time, I mean, now we just take all these things for granted.
Yeah.
But at the time, that was, I guess, seen by some as quite radical.
Yeah, it was.
And obviously, he was definitely a threat to the status quo.
He was.
Yeah.
He really dragged Australia out of almost the 19th, 20th century into the modern era.
Yeah.
I said he really went against the kind of British Tory entrenched culture, not just the political culture, but our kind of national culture.
Yeah.
He allowed women to actually have a say in a divorce, like women to be able to file divorce, for example. He, I'm pretty sure to do with, he provided state aid to women and children that were fleeing abusive relationships.
Yep.
At the time, this was all very radical.
Yeah, and like you said, I think quite importantly, kind of giving us that push to be able to shift our identity away from the British hangover, shall I say. Whereas someone like Menzies, he just wanted to hang on to being British. He wanted to hang on to that identity.
Yeah.
I think he often spoke about how much he actually despised returning home to Australia from Britain, because he was like this wretched colonial, cesspit. I'd rather be, in the British Parliament, So I think that kind of, regardless, I think you have that kind of top-down effect, where it trickles down from the upper echelons of society, and that will somewhat reflect what the rest of society.
Yeah, he did, and I think he really forged the Australian identity. I think that's very important. And it's interesting, I've been thinking about this. I would hope that Australian nationalists and those of the kind of right wing here in Australia would look fondly upon this. No, because he actually broke from Australia just being a British colony and said, no, like we should have our own national interests, our own identity. We shouldn't go to every war that the Brits do. We should actually have an Australian national anthem. Things where like you look at that national sentiment, you go, those are things I can agree with. Most famously, he wanted to buy back the farm, and that was to ensure that Australia had its own agricultural base, that we purchased the mines from the foreign multinational corporations that own them. There's quite a story behind that. But nowadays, most people here in Australia think those are completely the same policies, especially when it comes to food security. Yeah. So you get a lot of people here in Australia very upset about the influence of China owning Australian farmland, which people should be concerned of any foreign corporation or country owning our own food security, for sure. But that was something Whitlam really understood back then and pushed for it.
Of course, I think food security is incredibly vital in a ever more globalised world. I mean, we still have enough abundance here in Australia and a small enough population where we can provide for the population, but at the same time, that is essentially a lever, that's a sword that can be held over the head of any nation. Nations like Syria, Venezuela, Iran with the sanctions regimes, because their governments have been not liked by the West. This provides serious issues, like tens of thousands of people starve to death in Venezuela every year because they don't have food security.
And it's interesting because this political arrangement that still exists, the Governor-General still has the power to dismiss the Prime Minister.
Well, that's a bit, talking about separating ourselves, trying to get away from the British, this is a qualm that I have. Why on earth the Governor-General exists? Well, because we do not elect that man or woman. No. We do not elect them. And they are higher up than the Prime Minister, than our elected head of state.
Well, they're the representative of the king or queen of Britain.
Which we can't elect a king. So, Geordie, are you telling me... Sorry, I need to wrap my head around this. Maybe the audience can watch me do it in real time. that we're not really that democratic?
No. or sovereign in some
Or
ways.
sovereign, yeah.
But also there was a push for this, James. There was obviously Keating pushed for the Republic.
Yeah.
There was the referendum, which was voted against.
Yeah.
I imagine if that referendum happened today, it would be a lot closer.
Yeah.
I think there is still a certain proportion of the Australian public, especially the boomers out there, if you're listening, 40,
Yeah.
50 over, that identify as being British.
Yes.
And they still have that tie to the British.
To the British,
To the
yeah, of
empire
course.
itself.
Look, and obviously I think that's an important part of our national story.
It is
the fact that we were founded in our modern form by the British as a
Yeah.
British colony, and obviously you can't forget that. You
No,
can't
of
just
course
erase
not.
that from
No.
history. That's a part of who we are. It's a part of our story,
Yeah.
part of our national identity, regardless of whether we like it or not.
And there's parts of it I look quite fondly on.
Yeah, look, cricket, rugby, all the tea, all these things, but at the same time, it's kind of that, like, you got to grow up.
And get your and have your own identity.
Have your own
interest.
identity, yeah.
Interesting though, so Paul Keating came out recently and he just had an interview where he talked a little bit about the dismissal. And there was one moment in this interview that I thought was very striking, so I'd like to share it.
So my proposition was that Gough should ask the Queen to accept his advice about the appointment of a new Governor-General. And in the event that Kerr resisted, I said to Gough I thought he should be put under police arrest. And Gough said, Gough, yeah. And I said,
Found this a bit shocking.
a bit shocking, yeah. I said, the only thing you'd have to be sure about Gough is, of course, Kerr is technically the Commander-in-Chief, that the soldiers, that is the Chief of the Defence Force, do not end up in a fight with the police. In other words, you'd have to have the soldiers with you for this to happen. But then what would happen is you would then make a recommendation. The Queen could accept your recommendation. But I said, I think in all of that, you then have to go to a general election. That's what I thought. He said, thank you, you know all, for that advice. Thank you for your know all that advice. But you see, he wasn't of a mind to take the advice. He was a constitutionalist, Gough, He wasn't into blood and gore, He was a constitutionalist.
You think there would have been blood and gore?
Depends whether the army would have stuck with Kerr against the police. That's in my model. I mean, that's what I certainly would have done.
It's quite enlightening.
It is. It's very powerful because you think about it at that time. You had a Prime Minister that had just been dismissed, and then he would have contacted the Queen and asked the police, the federal police, to stand by him as he confronted and tried to arrest the Governor-General. And as Keating points out, a lot of people don't realise this, the Governor-General is the Commander-in-Chief.
Yes.
Has power over the Australian military.
Yeah.
And at that point, then would have the military sided with the disposed Prime Minister and the federal police, or would the military stood alongside the Governor-General? And as Keating said, he goes, you're borderline at civil
You're
war
a
at
civil
that
war
point.
stage,
You have the
yeah.
police and the military standing off against each other. However, and this is one thing I do always appreciate about Keating, it really shows you the political animal he was. Because at the time, during that situation, that's how he was thinking. He's like, all right, this is what we're going to go do. Citizens arrest, bring the police with us, bring the army onto our side. It's like...
Because that's how you get the political edge. That's how you win that political battle.
That's right.
Essentially, at the end of the day, you need to have those. Obviously, he's weighted up. You need to have those forces behind you.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's interesting that Gough, even though, because I've heard people, I don't know the law or the regulations involved, but people say that the dismissal was unconstitutional.
The reason it was unconstitutional because it went against the norms that are agreed upon.
Yeah.
Inside the Constitution.
Yeah.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, there's this loophole where the Prime Minister can be dismissed. However, that's not how we actually go about practicing Australian federal politics.
Of
It's not
course.
part of the norms of the Constitution itself.
Yeah.
So he obviously violated.
We're all gentlemen here, boys.
It's very British, isn't it?
It is very British. It's all very sporting. It's like, oh, good sport, old chap. I won, you lost,
Yeah.
But obviously keeping that air of civility.
Yeah.
So why... What can you provide me and the audience with some of the evidence for there being these external actors having an important role in this dismissal?
Yes, I can, James. I certainly can. So there's a couple of things that people point to, and I think they're quite significant. I don't think they're to be dismissed.
No.
One of them comes from a book by William Bloom. And basically,
Fantastic book.
Yeah, so it's his book called Killing Hope.
Yep.
Obviously, it's about CIA involvement in countries, overthrowing their elected governments, and he talks about how the Australian intelligence services provided support to the CIA in their wars against the Allende government in Chile.
Yep.
Obviously, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, we were quite close with the US intelligence services. And so basically what happened was...
Which all did not, like, none of those things were good.
No,
That's
no,
just saying,
definitely not.
all those, that was it was some very violent and horrific incidents that overthrew democracy in other parts of the
what
world.
happened was when Whitlam came into power, he realised that ASIO and the Australian intelligence services had been doing all this.
Yeah.
And he was quite disgusted. He said, this is ridiculous, that we're violating other countries' sovereignties, we're basically just playing alongside the empire. He was quite shocked. So in 1976, there was an Australian Royal Commission that unearthed that ASIO had been supplying the CIA with damaging information about Australian politics and the government. So during Whitlam's time in office, he caught wind of this and began to challenge the intelligence services. So he actually basically... fired the head of ASIO and ASIS for assisting the CIA in covert operations. And then basically the CIA just became... They were basically so horrified.
Yeah.
They were like, you can't do this. Like, what are you talking about? You can't go in and just start firing the head of the intelligence service. Like, they're our puppets. They're an extension of our power.
Yep.
And so when this happened and he levelled charges against a CIA agent in Australia, Richard Starlings, who'd been channeling funds to the leader of the National Party... They were just completely dismayed. So Whitlam had done this, and then what happened was there was a man called Christopher Boyce who was working for one of the US contractors, and he was sitting there and he was reading all the teleprompters, all the messages going back between the intelligence services, and the CIA said that Kerr was our man.
Of course.
And
So the Governor-General was not only essentially an agent of the British...
Yeah.
But he's also an agent of the United States.
Yeah, and he'd met directly. He'd went into Pine Gap and met with the US intelligence services. I think it was 2 to 3 times in the week leading up to the dismissal. So obviously it's not a smoking gun.
No.
But it's like if you're meeting with the CIA and then in a a conversation that someone picks up on, they say he's our man. It's like, well...
That is... Look, it's pretty close to a smoking gun,
It's
I
very
have to
close
say.
to it,
Yeah.
And the author of that book, William Bloom, asserts that if this had been a third world country, the CIA would likely have already sent the government packing.
Yeah, of course.
Because this follows what the CIA were doing in all other countries.
Including the United States, one might say, with the Kennedy situation as well.
Yeah, but any government, any nationalist government that came to power in the third world that said, okay, we want to take control of our natural resources, we want to have a sovereign government, the CIA stepped in. What was it, like 50 to 100 times since World War II?
Yeah, of course. Even things as, as banal as like in Guatemala, for example, Jacobo Arbenz, let's take back all the land that the United Fruit Company owns, ousted military coup. So
this is from John Pilger's book, who was an Australian journalist. He wrote a book on this. One of the chapters is titled The Coup. It's really good. It's very heavy in detail. He just puts together all the circumstantial evidence of the CIA operating in Australia at the time. One of them that I found quite damning is that when a senior CIA officer revealed in the 1980s that the Whitlam problem had been discussed by William Colby.
Ah, yes.
Who was the head of the CIA at the time and whose, is it son or grandson?
Is Eldridge Colby.
Eldridge Colby, who's head of the current Pentagon government at the moment. Head of the government of the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And so at the time had been discussed with William Colby that the CIA director and head of MI6, Sir Maurice Oldfield, had urged the matter to be dealt with urgently. The CIA deputy director said Kerr did what he was told to do.
There you go.
This is coming from the head of the US and UK intelligence services.
Yeah.
This isn't some crackpot sitting there writing this in a book.
Now, of course, and like you said, not the smoking gun.
No.
But we're getting quite close.
The gun's warming up.
The gun's warming up.
Yeah. And there was so after this had happened, Whitlam met with a representative of the US administration under Bill Clinton, and he met with him afterwards, and Whitlam talks about this in one of his books. And he says that this representative, Bill Clinton, apologised to Whitlam and said, look, we'll never interfere in the Australian political system ever again.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice of them. So they admitted that they did interfere.
It's so on the nose, though.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
it
And the
is.
problem is that, and I can understand this, is that in Australia, historians and in Australian academia, they can't take this as serious evidence that the foreign intelligence services were involved. But at what point does all this evidence mount up to where they're literally saying, look, we'll never do it again. He did what he was told to do. Kerr's our man. It's like...
Yeah, and I think, so I believe recently, within the last couple of years, there was a bunch of like kind of released letters between Buckingham Palace
Yes.
and Kerr. And I remember seeing there was a book on sale at the bookstore, and it was just about how, and it kind of, I'm reading the blurb and skimming a few pages, it kind of presented how these letters kind of painted the until now untold story of the communications between Buckingham Palace and Kerr, which kind of enlightened everyone on the dismissal, but again, didn't really seem to shine a light on any of these issues that we're talking about now. They just kind of seem to go... Let's get brushed under the rug, unless you're a real firebrand like a John Pilger, for example.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, James, before we kind of wrap up, what I want to do was play this video by Christopher Boyce. He was the man that saw the communications between the intelligence services. So this is quite interesting. He actually defected from his role working for a US government contractor, and he provided a whole lot of secrets to the Soviets at the time during the Cold War, because he was so disgusted with what the US were doing in other countries. And I think he does mention this in the interview. He's like, I was brought up loving my country, but once you saw what we were doing around the world, he goes, I just became so disconnected. So this is quite interesting.
Well, they spoke openly about this, did they?
Well, yes, Mr. Whitlam was not a popular figure at all, to say the least.
Did they say why?
Well, first of all, it's politics, socialistic, and the fact that inquiries were being made about the base. Mr. Whitlam was, by wanting to know what was going on there and by publicizing it, was compromising the integrity of the project.
Compromising the integrity, was that?
That's a familiar term that I heard quite a bit.
Did you
Mr.
get
Whitlam had no business sniffing around the Rhyolite project. To their view, he was on the wrong ball club.
Even though the bases were in Australia?
Well, yes, Mr. Whitlam's government was a threat.
That's the way they described it?
Yes.
Did you get the impression that things had changed once the Labor government, the Whitlam government, came into office from what they had been before? And did they change after he left?
It was a bit of celebration that Mr. Whitlam had been canned, but my instructions as to what was to be sent on to Merino and Casino...
And Merino Casino was Canberra, and Merino was Alice Springs.
Correct. Did not change, no.
So after Mr. Fraser was elected Prime Minister after Mr. Whitlam, the instructions were still the same?
Remained the same.
Did they talk about how or why he was forced out?
No, but there was references to your Governor General by the Central Intelligence residents there at TRW in the Rhyolite Project. They called Mr. Kerr our man Kerr.
What, the CIA man said that?
Yes, Joe Harrison said that in the security area. One time I ever heard that.
Christopher Boyce telling what he knows about the CIA and its meddling in Australian politics. But he goes on to mention other disturbing events, including CIA infiltration of Australian unions. More of that part of the spy's story after this break.
Well, there you go, James. The US intelligence services were celebrating the dismissal of Whitlam and referred to Kerr as our man.
So it's ostensibly saying the Governor General who enacted the dismissal was working at the behest of another outside actor, and then that outside actor, the CIA, everyone was celebrating.
Yes. Could be a complete coincidence.
I'm sure it is, Jordy. No, we're getting closer and closer to that smoking gun.
Definitely.
Essentially. And I think as well, like it's interesting that this has never happened in federal parliament. This has never happened before.
No.
And never happened since.
No, it has not. However, it did happen in the 1930s during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
The Conservatives inside the Senate blocked supply to Jack Lang.
That's at a state level.
At a state level, correct. Yeah. Because once again, a Labor government disposed the British Empire, didn't want to pay the the interest on the loan to the Brits, and they did the same thing to destabilise the Jack Lang government.
And then that ended up with Jack Lang obviously getting ousted as well, no longer being premier.
Yeah.
So we can see how this works.
There's a pattern.
There's a pattern. There's
sure.
a pattern at play.
Yeah.
And I guess that would kind of indicate that ever since then, because no government has had supply blocked in Parliament, could we kind of safely assume that no government since then has been willing to rock the boat that much?
Not in a significant way.
Yeah.
Not like the Whitlam government.
And some people argue Kevin Rudd,
yes.
but I think that was probably a bit more domestically motivated as well.
Yeah, definitely. But this is still relevant today, James. I think this sticks with the current Labor politicians and other like-minded reformers, is that they know what happened to Whitlam, and I think they are quite scared of what happened, is that it can repeat itself, definitely. And you're right, James. It definitely also changed the culture. So Paul Keating talks a little bit like this. I'll play this.
The unreasonableness of it. But, Nicky, all the goodwill went out of the system after that. Before that, I was there for 2 opening of Parliament balls. This was 1969 and 1972. And there was a generosity in between the parties, I remember my backbench colleagues in the opposition joining me at the Currajong Hotel later. I brought my mother down for the opening of Parliament ball, and this was true in 69 and 72. But after dismissal, all that goodwill evaporated, never to return. It's never returned.
So yeah, he illustrates that perfectly as how the culture changed after that.
I guess it becomes a bit more cutthroat.
It becomes significantly more
Some
cutthroat.
of those sporting gentlemanly rules have been broken.
Yeah,
and you can't put it back together after
That's
it's
right.
been broken.
It's not just a game of politics.
Yeah.
And after he was disposed as well, interesting enough, when Fraser became the acting Prime Minister, there was a vote in the House of Representatives. There was a vote of no confidence, and it passed. And they went to the Governor-General and said this, and nothing was done about it.
Of course, because he was towing the line.
Yeah.
One can assume that's why.
But it also shows, James, how just our constitution and our political norms can just be thrown out the window.
It doesn't really mean anything.
No, it doesn't.
If it doesn't, yeah. If it doesn't
And
have to.
Speaking of Fraser, let's wrap this segment up, because Keating mentioned something here about Fraser, which I found very fascinating. And he talks about how neither him nor Fraser would have allowed US troops into Australia.
Of course. Which we are seeing an ever-growing presence. And it is, in my opinion, a threat to our sovereignty.
Definitely.
Obviously, we don't have much sovereignty, as has been demonstrated by what we're discussing this entire segment, but it's an even greater threat. But how even then, like Malcolm Fraser still had that idea of being an independent nation.
Yeah, being an independent country, having sovereignty of your borders.
Yeah, look, Malcolm Fraser obviously, acted to remove Gough Whitlam, but he did do, credit where credit's due. Yeah. He did do a lot of good stuff, I think, all things considered.
And we've talked about this before, James, it just shows you the difference between the political class of then and now.
Yeah.
It is quite frightening to see.
We're not better off.
No. Look, James, I said it before. I'm going to say it again. Let's wrap the segment up with a Michael Parenti quote.
Yeah.
When change threatens to rule, the rules must change.
Perfect.
If you like our content, please share, like, and subscribe. We'll see you later.
See you later, guys.